Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's noon o'clock. You are here at the webinar for the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project today, and we are talking today about Hispanic and Latino students and significant disproportionality and disproportionality. So you're going to hear from our two presenters, our experts today, who are going to speak for just a little bit. First, I just want to welcome you and remind you that this is brought to you by the California Department of Education, which provides the funding for SPP-TAP and all of the services that we provide to you. So you've joined us on your computers. Just know that you're also welcome to use your phones. If you want to use that for your audio, you're welcome to do that as well. So either option should work for you today. Those of you, we have, a little over 150 of you with us already. If you'd like to go ahead and chat and just let us know that you're here, you can put your name in there, the district that you're from, or organization. It's always nice to see who's with us. So again, welcome. We are going to have some interactive pieces in our session today. So there's a few different ways you can interact. One is to use your chat, right? So you can just write in chat as you are now to greet us. And then also you will see a couple polls during the session, so you'll be asked to respond to a few things via poll on your screen. And also, if you have paper and pencil, there'll be some times where you might just be asked to think about something and may want to jot something down, and obviously for note taking. So we do want you to know that this meeting is recorded, so if you want to listen rather than be taking notes, that's fine. It is recorded and we will have it archived on our website, as we do with all of our SPP-TAP webinars. Okay, so again, we welcome you, and I'm going to take just a minute before I pass it to our two presenters. I want to introduce them briefly and let you know who's going to be sharing their great information with you today. We have two presenters, Dr. Zaida McCall-Perez and Dr. Paul Luelmo. And let me just again briefly give you some information on them. So Dr. Zaida, as she likes to be called, her passion is for education. It stems from her bilingual, bicultural, and bi-ethnic life experiences, and is informed by an extensive career as a secondary teacher, program director, site and district administrator, and currently as a teacher educator. She conducts research in a multi-year collaborative project about California's immigrant school-age population. Several publications from that research have been pivotal in influencing immigrant education policy in California. She was part of the research team that first introduced the concept of long-term English learners, or L-TEL. Dr. Zaida has drawn upon her expertise to address issues of racial ethnic diversity, equity issues, and the intersectionality of special education and English learners. So welcome, Dr. Perez. And then Dr. Paul Luelmo. Dr. Luelmo is an assistant professor of special education at San Diego State University. Paul has teaching and administrative experience in low resource, racial and ethnic minority urban charter school settings in Los Angeles. He grew up in Mexico and is fluent in Spanish. His background has helped him implement evidence-based, culturally responsive teaching strategies, such as culturally responsive educational systems. He has used these skills to empower and educate underserved communities in Los Angeles, and his efforts have focused on serving Latino and African American students with disabilities and English language learners. His current research project involves a parent-to-parent advocacy intervention employing community-partnered participatory research in a low-resource racial and ethnic minority setting. I also want to add that both doctors with us here today are SPP-TAP TA facilitators who work throughout California to assist districts as they approach disproportionality and significant disproportionality. So I'm going to go ahead and get off screen for you and turn it over to the two of you, and thank you very much and welcome.
Hi everyone, and thank you very much for that nice introduction, Connie, and thank you everybody for attending this webinar. We hope that you find the information we present very useful for the work that you're doing in your schools and your districts. These are the main points that Dr. McCall and I will be covering today during this presentation. First, we will start by sharing a common understanding of who is Hispanic or Latinx in disproportionality reporting in the state of California. Second, we will identify formal and informal factors that may contribute to root causes of disproportionality within the Hispanic community. And third, we will introduce and review extrinsic cultural and linguistic factors, which are oftentimes critical to our Hispanic community. Finally, we will share with you resources and tools that you can use as you develop your CCEIS plans. But to start this conversation, I want to introduce a picture of my partner and I to show how labels, and in particular ethnic labels, can be sometimes misleading. On the right-hand side, you will see my partner, who is from Morocco, and he is considered white here in the United States when he has to check one of those boxes. On the left, you see me and my dog, and I was born in California, grew up in Mexico, and considered Latino in this country, or more specifically, Mexican-American. As a side note, our dog is a French bulldog, but you may know that bulldogs are English or British. I don't know how French he is. What I want to emphasize here is that race and ethnicity are social constructs with peculiarities only in existence within the American context. As I show you in this picture, oftentimes labels do not inform much about who we are as people, the color of our skin, our life experiences, or the languages that we speak. Now, having said that, it is important to also know that labels, and most importantly, the way that you are perceived racially and ethnically in America, have real consequences for someone's life. So what are these consequences, in particular for students who are labeled as Hispanic or Latinx in California? But let me take a step back and ask, who are Hispanic or Latinx? First, let me clarify that I will be using Hispanic and Latinx interchangeably throughout this presentation to refer to students that come from a Latin American culture or background. Now, we can have an entire debate about the differences between these two labels. But for now, I want you to know that as an academic and Latino myself, I prefer to use the term Latinx. However, the data systems in our state will use Hispanic to refer to Latinx or Hispanic students. So just know that I will be using them interchangeably today. What I want to emphasize in this slide is that Latinx students can be of any race and speak many other than Spanish languages. What is important to know, especially for your work in your districts, is that when a parent checks the box Hispanic, then the child will be reported as Hispanic in your information CALPADS systems, regardless of any additional race or ethnicity. Hence, Hispanic students in California can be white, Black, Asian, or in many instances, they can be Native American, who are oftentimes labeled with the Hispanic ethnic category. This is important because the Hispanic category or label in our school system might not, and oftentimes is not telling you a lot about who your students are. From this information, we know that 54% of students in California are identified as Hispanic. But as I said before, these students could be of any race or cultural background. Lastly, I want to make the point clear that being Hispanic does not mean being an English language learner. But to let you learn more about that, I'm going to pass it on to Dr. McCall, who will be talking about English language learners and the Hispanic category in racial and ethnic disproportionality in special ed. And I'll come back to you in a few minutes. Hi, Dr. McCall.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Luelmo. So we're going to take a closer look in the next few slides at the definitions of Hispanic. I self-identify as Latina, and I will also use interchangeably the term Hispanic and Latinx and Latino because, in fact, that's the category that the CALPADS uses and that our government uses. One of the key questions is, always who is and who's not, as well as who decides. The truth of the matter is, we self-identify. And this can sometimes be confusing because we may self-identify one way and the world around us may perceive us in another way. We know, according to science, that there is no physical basis for the concept of race. There's only one human race. Nonetheless, we keep collecting racial ethnic data for schools, for medicine, for many purposes in our society. I think it's important to understand a little bit about what our US Census called for, especially this year. The social construct of race, according to our US Census from which it emanates, is that there were 5 races available on the census. They were white, Black or African American, Asian, American Indian or Native American, and 5th, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. A 6th possibility existed called other. You'll notice there was no racial category for Hispanic nor brown. As Dr. Luelmo did, I'm going to share a little bit of some of my family. So in this picture, you see my mother in the middle. And my mother was from Puerto Rico, where she was born and raised, and I was also born. She was a Spanish speaker, learned English as an adult, graduated from the University of Puerto Rico, where she later became an ESL teacher. Next to her is my brother, Ken. I have several brothers. This particular brother is the one who has difficulty getting back through the border from Mexico to the US because they interrogate him about his Spanish, of which he has absolutely none. The 2 children on the right are his children, my niece and nephew, Maya and Victor. They're now teenagers. As teenagers, I can tell you that Maya strongly self-identifies as Latina and is particularly passionate about her indigenous heritage. Our grandfather is of Taino descent, indigenous from Puerto Rico. Her little brother, Victor, as you can see, does not present as Latino. Maya's been trying to persuade Victor that he can, in fact, and is legitimately Latino and should self-declare in that manner. Victor has not been persuaded. On this year's census, this is what it looked like for those of us who were completing it as Hispanics. It was a 2-step process. Our first step was not to identify by race, but to identify by ethnicity as a yes or no. And once we identified as Hispanic or non-Hispanic, the second step was a forced choice of white or Black. Beyond that, on the census I completed, there was a window to specify where that whiteness came from with all kinds of choices like German, Irish, etc. And then if indigenous, one could specify in that category as well. It was the first time I got to specify under indigenous the Taino heritage of my mother's side of the family. As Dr. Luelmo noted earlier, part of the reason the self-identity, even the self-identification is confusing. I have graduate students who enter my Latino culture class every year wondering whether they're actually Latino or not. And it is that Hispanics can be of any race. You can see by this picture what that overlap is. So how does the racial ethnic data actually get to CALPADS for the disproportionality reports that you receive? Here's a sample from a school district. Typically, school districts collect racial ethnic data that is important to them. So in this particular district, you can see that they were collecting on the racial ethnic survey of parents as they entered the district. They were collecting subgroups of Asian ethnicities. Well, according to the census, this is a race. Chinese, Korean, etc., as you can see. And then when that data got migrated to CALPADS, it was aggregated into one group and moved into Asian. In the bottom square on the left-hand side, you can see that the Hispanic ethnicity is also a two-step process, with the first step being a declaration of ethnicity. In the case of CALPADS, once that ethnicity has been indicated as Hispanic, that's how it migrates to CALPADS. The process has included that parents do the self-identifying of their children at the point of registration. In rare instances, there is a provision for a third party to identify if the parent has declined to do so. As we take a look at trying to unpack the concept of ethnicity, sort of absent the issue of race, it's useful to look at the Hispanic ethnicity in terms of country of origin, language, and citizenship. And you can see by this Venn diagram that it's hugely variable. That on the far left, we have individuals who are not citizens or not citizens yet. They may be immigrants in various stages of becoming citizen. They may be monolingual Spanish speakers and non-US born. Dr. Luelmo has an interesting case because he was born in the US and educated, as I believe, in Mexico. So that one isn't even represented here. In the far right, we have US born, English only, and US citizens. That would apply to my brother Ken, who you saw in the earlier picture. He was born here in the US. He's very fluent with just the words taco, cerveza, and por favor, and he is a US citizen, although that's frequently questioned when he travels. In the middle, we see that combination where one may be US born or not, may speak Spanish, may speak both languages, may be a US citizen, may actually have dual citizenship. Thank you. So when we take it a step further to look at ethnicity specific to the Hispanic category, one of the ways to look at it is to look at it in terms of proximity to the generation that immigrated and proximity to a Spanish speaker. In that instance, a 1.0 would be the immigrant generation. These might or might not be, but would typically be those who speak only Spanish. The 1.5 generation are frequently the young child immigrant who immigrated with the parent, came here as a young child. They may be a dual language learner, they may be an English learner, they may have been classified initially or reclassified as English proficient. At the university level, we frequently reference this 1.5 generation as the children of immigrants. And then the 2.0 generation would be the child of immigrant parents. This one was born here, but they are children of immigrant parents. You can see the variety of kinds of language practices that may exist and proficiencies. By the third generation, very frequently they are the grandchildren of immigrants, English only and or Chicano speakers. And this, for instance, although Puerto Ricans are not immigrants because we are US citizens, but an example would be my niece and nephew, Maya and Victor, who are English only. And very often this generation is looking to reconquer, as one of my professors used to tell me, the Spanish language. They've lost it and are eager to become Spanish speakers. In other cases, they may be speakers of what we've now come to understand as Chicano English. And finally, in the fourth generation, where typically assimilation is complete, meaning the population is English only, and they are in all means indistinguishable from the general population. There are exceptions in bilingual countries. So for instance, my cousin in Puerto Rico and her children and her grandchildren are now fourth generation bilinguals, proficiently in Spanish and English. That's not typically true in the US. And now Susan has a poll for you.
Welcome everyone. I am going to launch the poll, and you'll notice that there are 2 questions. You want to be able to make your first selection, and then you're going to scroll down to choose the second selection. The top selection is about which generation your family spoke a language other than English, and your second selection is around which generation in your family contained immigrants. We'll give you a moment to complete that poll, and we'll be back in a minute. Give you another 15 seconds to enter in your answer if you haven't done so already. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Zaida, as you can see, most of the people have either family members in their own generation or in their grandparents' generation that spoke a language other than English. And at the bottom, immigrants in both the parents and the grandparents' generation and the great-grandparents' generation rank the highest.
That's very interesting. Let me just share that on April 15th, Governor Newsom, in his daily briefing, happened to mention that 1 out of 2, really 50% of children being born today in California are being born to parents, one of whom is an immigrant, a mixed combination. So we're seeing an interesting demographic change, which I will refer to as we move along. The next few slides we're going to take a look at are going to take a look at more of the English learner issues very specifically. As Dr. Luelmo noted earlier, and I think it's really important to understand that Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx is not one and the same as EL, English learner, as our K-12 public schools define it. The English learner is a subgroup within typically not just the Hispanic population, but also other language groups. I mean, it's also true within the Asian language groups where there are other languages. But today we're going to be dealing specifically with Hispanic. So the process begins at registration again, where a lot of data is collected. Parents come in to register for school, and they are asked to complete a home language survey. And that home language survey typically is part of the registration form. It contains 4 questions. These days, those 4 questions are the ones you see here. Interestingly enough, these questions are primarily, they're a mix of what languages the parent speaks and what languages the son or daughter speaks. Remember that sometimes there are differences between children. In my own family, I grew up speaking Spanish. I grew up speaking both languages by the time I entered kindergarten. That was not true of my brothers. Also, in this process, it used to be that the regulations in California required that once this, let me just say that if 3 of these are responded to as a different language, then that triggers an assessment of the English language proficiency. It can be a little challenging because sometimes, parents have gotten word that their child may be stigmatized by being put in an ELD class, and they are trying to bypass that, and they will do some interesting things on these surveys. When I used to be the keeper of these, we were stumped to figure out what to do with the one that said Inglés, 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 Inglés. This picture elaborates a little more what that process looks like here in California. Let me note that in the same way, race is a social construct, so is the concept of who is and who is not an English learner. Because in fact, most of us born here, native English speakers, spend 12 years studying English in school. So aren't we English learners all the way through? But for purposes of the social construct of English learner and our determination about who needs explicit instruction in English as a new language, the home language survey is the first piece. The next piece is an assessment. The one going out of being is the CELT, C-E-L-D-T, that you've probably all heard of, and you'll find in student files, because we've been in transition now for 3 years, to the new one, which is the English Learner Proficiency Assessment of California. If a youngster scores at a level that is, by that exam, indicative of below proficiency, they're further categorized into currently 3 categories, EEB here, emerging, expanding, and bridging. Emerging representing the newcomer, the beginning of the language process. Expanding referring to a little more advanced, and bridging being somewhat like English language arts, with really a lot of overlap between the EL and the ELA programs. At the end of the process, so, I guess I could turn it into a riddle and say, when is an English learner no longer an English learner? And in our construct here in California, an English learner is no longer an English learner when they have achieved proficiency in English, and they are reclassified. Yeah, sometimes it's called redesignated, but the terms are used interchangeably. The presumption at the point of reclassification, which again is a criterion, a set multiple criteria, including the L-PAC exam, there's a presumption that the youngster is now competitive with native English speaking peers. Nonetheless, the achievement levels of a reclassified English learner are to be monitored by the school district to see that they don't fall back. Some years ago, the concept of a long-term English learner was introduced. It's taken quite a while for the field to catch up with this concept. And now in the practices in school districts, when a school district reports on its annual language census, who speaks what languages and who are the English learners and who are those who've been reclassified, they now also report L-TELs, long-term English learners. The long-term English learner is a student who was originally identified as an English learner, but has not been reclassified after 5 years. And that there's a provision that allows the student to be redesignated or reclassified as an L-TEL. Now, 5 years, I think, was chosen because the research typically says that it takes 5 to 7 years to become proficient in a new language. And if that hasn't happened by the end of 5 years, why they are identified as L-TELs. In this graph, that's right. In this graph, you can see that this is an interesting population because the original look at them, they tend to be somewhat bimodal, meaning that that they separate, that about 50% of them go on and become very proficient, maybe proficient in 2 languages, and some of them appear to plateau and become basically struggling learners without ever achieving the criteria for reclassification. I've come to believe that I see a number of these students at the university level who of course would never have been reclassified that because it didn't exist back then, but they tend to be students whose performance in in writing and reading in English never seems to yield more than about a C grade. They're not failing, but they're also not soaring. And the last thing I would say about it, which I'll mention again later, is that as a result of their performance, they are students whose oral English is going to sound native-like. They will be unaccented. They will sound pretty fluent in English. And their reading and writing skills are likely to be hugely disparate or discrepant from their oral language skills. We'll talk more about that later. I mentioned earlier the changing demographic in California. And this is a little bit of elaboration about that. One, I noted the mixed immigrant status, immigrant or immigration status of parents, with one as a citizen and one as a non-citizen. I was unaware that in addition, as Governor Newsom had described incidentally in one of his briefings during April, children currently being born in California are being born into families where one parent is a citizen and one is an immigrant, not necessarily a non-citizen, but is an immigrant. I think it's worth mentioning that this raises some questions for us to think about going forward about language usage, because families in which there are two languages may or may not choose to support and support the development of both languages. We've traditionally we've just come away from a devastating period of English onlyness in which children and parents were very cognizant of a social need to hide the fact that they spoke any other language lest they be discriminated against. And now what we have is children coming into our schools where in fact one of the parents may be a speaker of another language. We are, however, not testing for that upon their entrance. Couple that with the fact that Tony Thurman, our superintendent for instruction, has a global language initiative that calls for all graduating students from high school graduates in public schools in California to be proficient in 2 or more languages by the time they graduate by the year 2030. So we may be wanting, I think, to rethink how we look at ignoring the presence of another language, both in the incoming children and in the families. The second item here was what I had noted earlier about the children. The third one, there's also mixed language usage in the household. As I noted in my own family, as the oldest, I'm the only one who grew up bilingually. By the time my 3 little brothers were born, since my mother was also bilingual, and English was the milieu in which we were living in the Chicago area. My brothers grew up speaking English. One of them studied Spanish and became proficient in it, but that was Spanish then as a second language. And fourth, there's a new phenomena. The field of second language acquisition is now looking at youngsters in terms of what we call simultaneous and sequential bilinguals. In the past, we used to talk about which language was dominant or which was not dominant. And while that has a place, it's fading from importance because it is so difficult. It is so vague, difficult to create a fixed criteria. Instead, we are talking about children who are simultaneous bilinguals, and those would be children like I was, who grew up speaking 2 languages, arriving at kindergarten already with 2 languages. And the other one, which was sequential, which is when children arrive at school without any English and begin their process of learning English in the school. The difference between how we instruct and how we identify those children is significant. Here you see 2 children with the same parents and different profiles. And and I'll run through it quickly because I think I've made the point. On the left, we'll call her Maria, enters school speaking only Spanish. She's identified as a sequential second language learner. She needs to participate in an ELD class in order to learn English. On the right is her sister Olga, who was born in the United States. When she entered school, she was not identified as an English learner. She already met the criteria for fluent English proficient. Again, sort of a social construct because we all study English for 12 years. And at what point are we truly proficient? But Olga on the right is a simultaneous learner. She's going to continue learning. She's going to continue speaking Spanish at home, and she is going to continue learning English. Going back to the left-hand side, we see that Maria was not reclassified after 5 years. She didn't meet that criteria we've established, even though she has unaccented English and sounds just like a native English speaker. Her sister, Olga, also sounds like a native English speaker. On the left, however, Maria has become labeled L-TEL, long-term English learner. She is now sort of a struggling learner. She doesn't do as well in reading and writing as one would be expected. She also is perceived by the world around her as the stereotype that unfortunately exists in North America, that somehow Hispanic has a brown color associated with it in skin tone. On the right, we see that Olga, on the other hand, by the time she enters 5th grade, has experienced language loss. Unfortunately, if she were to be tested really beyond 3rd grade, she will have lost a lot of her Spanish. My mother, who taught ESL in Arizona, used to call me as her 3rd graders were graduating from her ESL class, lamenting the fact that as they left 3rd grade, they were beautiful bilinguals, and soon they will have lost their Spanish. Olga, as you can see, is fair-skinned and does not appear to the stereotypic expectations as Latina. So now as the lens sort of focuses down from the language census to the language testing to this construct of English learner and the idea of the L-TEL, bear in mind that the L-TEL looks a little like a youngster with a specific learning disability. The next few slides are going to address that aspect. Given what you know, new coming in or now know because you've paid good attention, I'm going to read this scenario to you. You may read it too, but while you're listening to it or reading it, bear in mind that afterwards there's going to be a poll asking you to indicate whether you would or would not recommend referring Javier in this instance to a student study team for assessment for special education. Javier, in this case, is a 6th grader in a K-6 school. He's originally from a rural area in Mexico. He's been referred for a student study team or student success team by his general ed teacher, his caring general ed teacher, Ms. Jones. She's worried about his very low reading and writing. She feels with this grade span leap, because he'll be going to middle school next year, he's not going to be very successful, and that maybe he has a learning disability. In any event, she feels that he would probably benefit from special education services. He's very popular among his peers. He's an excellent soccer player, highly orally verbal. She's surprised to learn that he's actually identified as an English learner because he has no accent in English. And she's further surprised that he's only been in the United States since the middle of 5th grade, barely 18 months. His EL-PAC scores indicate that he jumped 2 grade levels on that exam in 1 year. He moved from emerging to almost the bridging category. So I'm going to turn it over now to Susan for the poll.
All right. In this poll, we're going to see in just a moment. A question as to whether you would refer Javier for special education assessment or not. Give you about 30 seconds to make your decision because you're voting very quickly. Just a few more seconds, and then we'll share the results. All right, fantastic, everyone. Thank you. Let me share those results. As you can see here, Zaida, overwhelmingly, folks would not refer Javier for special education.
That's great. I would concur. I would also not refer for special education. But I take it a step further, and that is that Javier demonstrated really an accelerated rate of learning English by outstripping the norms of the year-for-year progress that the English proficiency test suggested. I think that's sufficient to consider that he may be linguistically gifted, and more than simply saying, gee, he doesn't need to be referred for special ed. Perhaps if in fact there's an accelerated path or a gifted program, he should be referred for that. Now there is an exception to who can or should be referred for assessment for special education, particularly under the category of specific learning disability. This population that is hard to distinguish is protected. There's an attempt to protect the population from being over-identified by the existence of some exclusionary clauses in IDEA 2004. There are other exclusionary clauses, but essentially under IDEA 2004, if poor academic performance is primarily due to lack of appropriate prior instruction, say in reading or language arts, or primarily due to lack of English proficiency, or primarily due to cultural factors, the youngster is not eligible for identification as having a specific learning disability. Unfortunately, I think a lot of our schools, because our general ed population has not been prepared to make this distinction, which is a subtle one. Many youngsters among our Hispanic population are being referred for assessment, and when they arrive with the specialist, the psychologist, or the educational specialist, they are not being qualified, to the disappointment sometimes of the referring teachers. Also, it takes a lot of district time and money to do an assessment of a youngster who in fact is an inappropriate referral. In other cases, youngsters are not referred soon enough because in fact the possibility does exist for a youngster to be both an English learner and have a specific learning disability.
Dr. Zaida, we have a couple questions in chat. I know we're running a little over on time, but I wanted to make sure we addressed those. There's a question from Steve. Do a lot of the L-TELs end up in special education?
I'm interested in answering that question as well. I'm aware that that information should be readily available through the CDE website. I checked with CDE earlier this year. I was looking for the EL data. The EL data has been uploaded, but apparently the L-TEL data is not going to be processed until July. But at the district level, a district should have that information and know where they have both where L-TELs are in fact being referred to special education. I think that it would not surprise me that there may have been some tendency out of compassion to say, gee, you know, this youngster needs more help. Let's refer him for special ed because he'll have a little more one-to-one attention, when in fact, what we're looking at is the possible absence of a prior ELD instruction. So the answer is I don't know, but I suspect.
Thank you. We also have a question from Serena who asks, what are your best practice recommendations for considering reclassification of EL students whose cognitive disabilities are primarily impacting their lack of English progress?
I'm actually going to talk to that a little later, and so will Dr. Luelmo. Okay. But let me just say that the big question there is establishing without cultural or linguistic bias that there are in fact cognitive limitations, because frequently the formal tests that exist and the assessors who participate may be making judgments without adequate information.
All right, thank you.
So around root causes, you can all, since we're a little shorter on time, let me just invite you to look at these. I think these are categories that most of you are familiar with, and I'll talk a little more about them in the following slides. Clearly, one of the possible root causes is always an issue of language. And I would say that's true for all children, not just Hispanic children, but designations of autism, speech and language, as well as specific learning disabilities call for a close look at language functions in the 4 domains of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And the SLD in particular looks at a discrepancy and anyway. And so even among our native English speakers, we're looking at those functions. So a key question in the look at possible root causes is, has there been a strong, structured, sequential, and consistent ELD, and I'm going to add ELA, English Language Arts, instructional program and curriculum to address the needs of EL and non-EL students at all grade levels and grade spans? And the reason I add ELA and all students is that in California, it's somewhat recent that we have added dyslexia to the list of qualifying disabilities for special education services. It is not a qualifying area under IDEA 2004, but as states are allowed to add their own, and that one has been added. So the issue of, so that also becomes a question for that population. There are a number of gaps in the assessment process that are sometimes hidden. And I'll draw attention in particular to the first one. There is certainly more aware to teachers at the edge of each grade span, at 6th going to middle school, or 5th going to middle school, and 8th going to 9th or going to high school. There's a systemic pressure and compassion to reclassify English learners between these grade spans. And that compassion comes from the very real fact that when youngsters go to the next grade span, with the designation of English learner, they may be required to include in their school schedule an ELD class, which may preclude their participation in elective offerings, music, band, elective, wheel, etc. And so there's sometimes an internal rush to really make that happen. The second item, misidentification of L-TEL as SLD, I've mentioned a little earlier, and I'll refer to again later. The use of linguistically or culturally biased cognitive measures to establish a discrepancy. And I think this might be a reference to the last question that was asked. I think we need to bear in mind that while we have, I think in California and perhaps nationally, done a fairly good job of avoiding using cognitive measures with the African American population, post Larry P., I don't think that we have had as conscious and committed a practice around looking at around what cognitive measures we use with populations who are who may have other cultural or linguistic considerations. And certainly the Hispanic population is an important one of those. And then finally, no one will be surprised by, none of our fault, but there is a shortage of bilingually proficient psychologists and teachers and other personnel. So I always say around this item, the real question to look at when a district is examining itself is, gee, when the gold standard can't be met, when there isn't a good team of persons who have these proficiencies, what are the lesser choices that get made? Because among the lesser choices, some of them are the worst of the lesser choices, and some are the least bad of the lesser choices. And the one I would refer to, and I frequently remind teacher candidates, is that to use a sibling as a translator is, in my opinion, the least, the most not good of the not good choices. Anyway. Not enough can be said about the linguistic and cultural bias in assessment, and it's a little less visible with our Hispanic, sequential, bilinguals population. The first is the discrepancy model. Those of you who've been up close to identifying youngsters for a specific learning disability under that category are aware that since the conceptualization of LD over 30 years ago, the discrepancy model has sort of been the gold standard. It presumes that if one can establish that a learner has cognitive aptitude that is not reflected in their academic performance, and that discrepancy is of a certain distance, that in fact that's likely to be a learning disability. That model was debated, has been in discussion for a lot of years, and finally in IDEA 2004, there were provisions to assure that there are some alternatives to that model. And in fact, in many states, there is a requirement that there not be a rigid discrepancy model as the only way to make the designation of learning disability. RTI, the response to intervention, which most of you are aware of, and the multi-tiered system of support, which is, the variation of that, are also part of the process. One has to bear in mind that each of those can, in fact, be linguistically or culturally biased, depending upon who's doing it, the proficiencies of the teacher, the assistant, the observer, or the publisher of or the creator of the activities that are being used, or the materials. Needless to say, IQ tests and subtests have a built-in cultural and linguistic bias. And I say that in particular because there's really no test. Our California population, in terms of the Hispanic population, is so broad across the spectrum around cultural and linguistic that even within the same family, we can't presume certain levels of cultural identity and practice, or of linguistic skills in two languages. So coming up with anything normed even on a California population would be misleading, but normed on a Spanish-speaking population from any country in the world would certainly not reflect the population we have in California, who are all in one phase or another English learners. They may be beyond the criteria. The home language survey, we talked about what some of the errors may be when a parent is looking to protect their child from that stigmatizing label, or wanting to be sure that they have access to curriculum that they may be denied by having to take an ELD class. We've also noted that now that the regulations for home language survey for testing do not require a district to in fact establish that a youngster is a speaker of the reported language, it's possible that youngsters being identified in that home language survey don't even speak the language of the home. The verification of that is optional, and sometimes, you know, I've seen where parents kind of think their kid is proficient because the youngster responds to Spanish, listens and comprehends, but actually is not producing it. And finally, the last item I would note, which we talked about with Javier, which is the failure to consider the rate of English acquisition. Certainly we know when we look at accelerated exceptionality that frequently the difference between a gifted youngster and or learner and one who isn't is the rate at which they are able to acquire new information and apply it. Best practices. A few here. I think that given the complexities of the Hispanic population, linguistically and culturally, we need to look at a lot of data collection before the actual assessment and done from multiple sources over a period of time. The first one I'm going to mention is, it's kind of interesting that we've typically not incorporated very much opportunity to allow a student to tell us in which languages they're proficient. I have found that over the years, children of all ages are able to pretty much, if you ask the right questions, able to pretty much tell you in what they can, in which language they can do what things. I myself, even as an adult, lack vocabulary for certain areas. Anyway, so there are a number of self-assessment instruments, one of which I've used and created, and others that exist in some of the materials that we'll be referencing here at the end. Pre-referral and pre-assessment checklists, family surveys, interviews, these are also important ways to collect information before a youngster is in fact passed on to that person who's going to be doing the eligibility assessments. Patterns of strengths and weaknesses, which is identified in the IDEA 204 as one of the alternatives to the discrepancy model, exists. I put a question mark by it because it's been received with some controversy, and for good reasons. I'm not sure that it is any less subject to cultural and linguistic bias unless the examiners or people using it are proficient in languages and cultures. The next bullet, which is extrinsic factors. In the case of our Hispanic population, I'm sure there's nobody in the room that, if we were in a room, that isn't right now aware here in California of the great anxiety, fear, concerns that many of our Hispanic families are living with in relation to deportation. And if it's not for their own immediate family, it may be for a relative, a grandparent, a cousin, many, not all, probably not as many fourth generation families as first and second generation families have, but even fourth generation families are likely to have extrinsic factors that are not going to show up in the CUME folder. I mean, fortunately, we are protected from having to inquire or demand to know what the immigration status is of the children who cross the threshold into our classrooms. This slide, I'll just briefly reiterate that we've got the potential misidentification. This is tricky and very subtle, so nobody should be beating themselves up about perhaps having been guilty of it, but I do think we need to look that this population can be, they can be either one or the other or both. They can have both labels appropriately, or they may be mislabeled. Finally, a limiting belief would be an example of BICS and CALP. I think BICS, as the basketball would indicate, is that social language. You don't need a lot of English, a lot of proper English, a lot of grammar, a lot of syntax to be able to be successful on the basketball court. You don't need it to be successful on the playground. And unfortunately, children at all grade levels, especially as they get older, are especially in a departmentalized schedule, might be able to get through a whole day with very little, if any, structured conversation beyond BICS with any other individuals throughout the school day. Cognitive academic language proficiency at the bottom, CALP, that's what children need in order to do that 6th grade report, in order to do their first research paper in high school. It's a cognitively demanding assignment that if only social language exists, a student will not be able to be successful academically. So the lookalike phenomena would just remind us that the rate of speaking differs from the rate of acquiring reading and writing, that it's very typical for second language learners to advance quickly in their speaking and listening skills and have a discrepancy in their reading and writing, which makes them look like they may be they may have a learning disability, and they may or may not. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Luelmo.
Thank you, Dr. Zaida. I'm just going to set up the presentation here. Okay. So for this second part of this presentation, I would like to focus more on culture. So thank you, Dr. Zaida, for the important information on Hispanic students and how second language may play a role in misidentification in special ed. Like I said, in this second part, I'm gonna present a case study of how working with Latino families can also influence the disproportionality of Latino students in special education. And finally, I wanna leave with a couple evidence-based practices that might avoid this disproportionality or might help you in addressing disproportionality for this group of students. But before I move forward, I just wanna clarify, as Dr. Zaida covered in the previous slides, that there is something that is very important about Latinx culture, and that is language. The Spanish language is commonly associated with Latinx culture. And as I'm showing in this picture, in California, 1 out of 3 Hispanic students is an English language learner as well. This is important because, as Dr. Zaida mentioned, language might be a factor in the misidentification of students with disabilities, but it is not the only factor. I want to show you how linguistic but also cultural differences in the family may play a crucial role in disproportionality in special education, especially for minority parents and minority children. So now bear with me as I read you a real story from years ago when I was a special education teacher in Los Angeles. As you listen to this story, please try to identify cultural differences and power differentials that may result in the misplacement of, in this case, Jose, in special education. Bear with me, please, as I read this to you. Maria grew up in a Zapoteco rural community, an indigenous pre-Columbian civilization from Oaxaca, Mexico. In the 1990s, an economic crisis decimated her agricultural production in her farming community. Millions of Mexicans living in rural communities like hers were forced to migrate to Mexican border cities in search of jobs and to the United States in search of work. Maria was one of the many Zapotecas who migrated with no documents to Los Angeles, California, where an estimated 51,000 Zapotecas and Mixtecas, a related ethnic group from Mexico, now reside. Maria's first language is Zapoteco, a language spoken by about 500,000 people in Mexico. While she has very little formal education, she managed to learn Spanish while growing up in Mexico. Her ability to speak and understand Spanish has been useful while living in a city like Los Angeles. She does not speak any English. Maria and her 12-year-old son live together in a studio apartment. Maria cares deeply about her child's education, and for her is her American dream. Her child, Jose, is now a 7th grade student. Maria checked the Hispanic box or LATINX box in Jose's school registration form. Maria receives frequent calls from the school staff about Jose's behavior. He often runs out of the classroom, interrupts teachers, and uses profanity in and out of the class. As a result, Maria was asked to sign an evaluation form and attend an individualized education program meeting for Jose to see if he qualified for special education services. While Maria's work schedule is not flexible and oftentimes punitive for missed work, she managed to attend the meeting. During this initial IEP meeting, Maria was expected to engage in the discussion and to know her legal rights regarding the IEP. The bilingual, Spanish-speaking, special education teacher started the meeting by giving Maria 2 different booklets in Spanish. One is titled A Parent's Guide to Special Education Services, and the other, The Least Restrictive Environment. While these are informative booklets in Spanish, much of the content of these booklets is based on US federal law called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which includes complex legal and educational terminology that can be hard to understand. Since Maria has very little formal education, she cannot read nor understand any of these materials. Additionally, Maria is expected to have a general sense of the least restrictive environment for Jose. She is also expected to listen and understand Jose's academic and behavioral strengths and challenges. For example, oral reading fluency, grade level reading comprehension benchmark, etc. Maria reported feeling intimidated by being surrounded by 4 different school professionals at the meeting: a special education teacher, a school principal, an English teacher, and the school psychologist. The special education teacher is expected to explain the purpose of the meeting to everyone, have a clear agenda, and recommend the appropriate placement and services for Jose. Maria is quiet during the entire duration of the meeting, as she respects the professional opinions and very official-looking reports from the school. It is clear that she does not understand her role and thinks the real reason for the meeting is that Jose keeps getting in trouble. The English teacher determines that Jose needs to be moved from a general education class to a special education class, where he will be in a small class setting with a special education teacher during the duration of the school day. Maria, not knowing what options she has, agrees to the English teacher's recommendation and everything else that is discussed in the meeting without ever questioning anyone. Now, as I went through the case study, may you please write in the chat box to some cultural differences, so power differentials, that you see may result in the misplacement of Jose in special education. And I'll give you a minute to do that, or maybe half a minute since we're running out of time. Parent as equal participant. teacher as expert, parent not a partner, trusting in the experts, not feeling like they understand enough. Yes, not okay for a parent to ask questions. The respect the parent has for the educator's opinion. Power of language proficiency, cultural honor. Yes. Not designated ally for the parent, a very good one, very needed in so many communities. No school participants that have experience with parent background, excellent point. What other IEP documents provided in parents' native language? Yeah, in this case would be Zapoteco language. Indigenous interpreter, very good. All of these are great points. And bias and assumptions were made about the language she's fluent in, definitely. Assumptions and biases, and indigenous language, definitely. Nonetheless, she and Jose are categorized as Latino or Hispanic, right? But that doesn't show the picture, the full picture of who they are. Primary language not honored. Thank you everybody for your participation. I'm gonna move on in the interest of time. And I wanna show that the story of Maria is not unique. Research shows that Latinx families may face additional challenges in navigating the special education system, in particular families from indigenous backgrounds that are categorized as Hispanic, like in the case of Maria. Spanish-speaking Latinx families, just Spanish-speaking, report that schools often lack support necessary to bridge communication gaps and misunderstanding in the IEP process. This is from the research literature. Some consequences of these parent engagement challenges include the late identification of Latino and African American students for autism. We know from the research that they tend to get a late identification or a misidentification when compared to white children. And these family engagement strategies are so critical to the IEP process in order to address disproportionality. And that's what I want to show you next, just with a couple of examples of evidence-based practices that are used to determine eligibility in specific learning disabilities. Now, we don't have a lot of time to go into depth about these two, but I just want to mention them out there and make a couple important points as that they relate to Latinx families, okay? Evidence-based practices for preventing disproportionality, not just for Latinx students, but for any minority student, include culturally responsive multi-tier systems of supports or culturally responsive RTI, response to intervention, as well as culturally responsive family and community engagement. First, I want to tell you about culturally responsive multi-tier systems of support that includes all of these aspects: shared leadership, database problem, multi-tier continuum of supports, and a few more. What I really want to emphasize here is that having a culturally responsive system of support really implies taking care of the first two things, the shared leadership and the database systems. The database systems that you build are critical. I have one teacher who recently told me that she doesn't look at students through race or ethnicity, that she just looks at data and responds to what the data shows. And that's great. I wish make instructional decisions if we don't have data to back those up. But just like people, data systems oftentimes can have biases in them. And I'm gonna give you an example that gets out of education, but just to make the point. For example, facial recognition software. I'm sorry. An MIT study found that facial recognition software that is commonly used by the police have errors of 34% more for dark-skinned women. This is a rate that is 49 times more than for white men. Okay, 49 times more error for dark-skinned women than for white men. This is for facial recognition software that the police currently uses. In a similar fashion, the assessment tools and data systems that we use to evaluate children for special education or to even monitor their progress are oftentimes embedded with biases. For example, we cannot use IQ tests assessments for African American students because a court in California has shown and demonstrated that these IQ tests tend to be biased. Now, these biases in the tools and the data systems that we use are not necessarily put in there to discriminate people or because there's a racist agenda. In the contrary, they're most likely just a reflection of the people who are creating these data systems. And their biases may go unconsciously or implicitly. If the people developing facial recognition software are mostly white male, it is not surprising to learn that the facial recognition software works better with white males. Similarly, if the test creators of the assessment tools that we use in special education are created by mostly white middle-class males, it is not surprising that some of the test items in the tests themselves will reflect some sort of the test creators' values and culture. And in doing so, we can ignore potentially valuable information about our students who come from minority backgrounds. So what I want to emphasize in this slide is that as you develop culturally responsive data system, it is important to have the shared leadership that is inclusive of the families that you serve. I want to go back to the case of Maria. How would you include this community when you're making these decisions about how do you keep data? How do you track data? What are the evaluation tools that you use? So in order to accomplish that, a second strategy that comes to mind would be family and community engagement. Effective family and community engagement will consider the values, experiences, languages, and culture of the families that you serve. And it starts with building trusting relationships with the family and the community that you serve. In the case study of Maria, not focusing on the Hispanic label, as I started this whole presentation, how labels can be misleading sometimes, not focusing on this label and actually learning about Zapoteco culture, not Mexican culture, not Latinx culture, not Hispanic culture, but actually her culture, and learning about all the other Zapoteco families that attended the school and that lived in the community would be a great start to be inclusive about who are the families, being inclusive with the families that we're serving. Trusting relationships are weak when educators make assumptions that some families do not value education or are not interested in supporting student learning. And when educators do not communicate effectively with families. The relationships are weak when families do not feel welcome at their child's school. Trusting relationships are strong when educators are culturally responsive and reach out to families to build partnerships, and all families feel welcome and respected at their child's schools. Finally, family engagement activities are aligned with district goals for student outcomes and families, and it's a two-way communication with the community that you serve. Finally, I see we're running out of time. We have a few resources to share with you before we let you go from this webinar. Now I'll pass it back to Dr. Zaida.
Before we get into too many of those resources, there are a couple other questions that are hanging out there. So if it's okay, let's go ahead and address those before we run out of time. And then we can share the resources in the slides. So Mary was really interested about the redesignation criteria for L-TELs. She's curious about the slide on redesignation after 5 years. It sounds like they're no longer receiving EL services, but she may be misunderstanding.
I believe that is the case. And that may vary from district to district, despite the fact that the regulations call for youngsters to receive designated ELD all the way until they are reclassified. Many districts stop providing the designated component after about 2 years, as soon as they establish oral fluency. So I think you need to look district by district.
Okay. And then there was a question from Sierra. If first language supports second language acquisition, why is it that we are not also looking at the quality of first language support, unless that's something that we've shared as well?
I think we're still recovering from the 227 and the English only movement. You know, not only are we not providing a lot of first language support, but we are actually not even identifying when youngsters are speakers of other languages with the potential to earn what is now established not just in California, but nationally as the seal of biliteracy. I think what we do know is that when children have, as I suspect our questioner knows, when they have proficiency in a heritage language, using both of those languages to teach is a plus. And actually the pedagogy for that these days is being called translanguaging, and it is what's being promoted. Previously in ELD classes, we used to teach that you had to only use English. We are now teaching that using translanguaging activities where the youngster uses both languages in their head is in fact a way to develop cognition and language. So you're right on the edge.
Great, thank you. And then it looks like there's one other question from Ed about BICS versus CALP. He's curious about the number of year difference for language acquisition between the two. CALP is up to 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, that is what the research tells us. And what we know, I think that the issue is that each of us have our rates of learning, and some people are particularly gifted in linguistically in learning a language, and other people are not, and we have different rates of that. But the average, Jim Cummins, I think, is the source of that information, is that it is a 5 to 7 year process to become proficient in a new language.
All right, thank you. And as more questions come up, we'll encourage participants to reach out to you both directly. So if we want to go ahead and go with the tools, we can go ahead and move on with those. Thanks, Dr. Luelmo and Zaida.
The tools that were listed that Dr. Luelmo was going to identify are some of this, what we've talked about earlier, things like, so I'd just like to identify that at the federal level, the U.S. Department of Education has a very complete English learner toolkit. Again, this is a resource that addresses that subgroup of English learners, those who've been designated as that. It's also a 2017, so the field is moving fast, and but it does have some in the appendices, and I would particularly recommend Chapter 5. This is my very favorite for right now, and it's from our very own California Department of Education. It has a very complete compendium, appendices with pre-referral forms, pre-assessment forms, extrinsic interview checklists. It is the most recent publication because it's a 2019. It does not, however, go as far as to address the L-TEL population. And San Diego Unified School District, so Dr. Luelmo's part of the world, has a very fine district evaluation process. Again, this one is for that subset of English language learners, so it's very useful in that way. And some of the instruments listed in the appendices here were included in the California appendices, and people who authored this were part of the group that developed the one for CDE. So preliminarily, these are certainly a few. And although this one, this is where you might see where you can see the pivotal summary of the research on L-TELs. despite the fact that it's 2010. I've listed it because it is sort of where it sort of hit the public knowledge, and talks about what programmatically needs to be done and the tremendous risk that exists for this population in terms of success. Its principal author was Lori Olson, who many of you are aware of. Last but not least, I would like to thank the practitioner advisors who were kind enough to give some input and validation to information that was provided here. And most of all, to all of you for staying with us all this time. I see by the number of participants, 206. I'm actually impressed. Dr. Luelmo, it's good we didn't know there were so many when we started. This is a hugely difficult time for our schools in so many kinds of ways. We just commend you all for taking the time at this time of year to commit to adding to your knowledge base and your practices on behalf of our Hispanic population. We sometimes are very invisible and misunderstood, and it is quite warming to see that so many of you are interested in knowing more. So Dr. Luelmo and I thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, of course, Paul and Zaida, for the great information. You can see from the comments that people are very, very interested in what you have to share today, and probably will reach out to you with some of their own individual questions. But yes, you'll see that we can definitely share the recording with folks that are interested in getting that before it's actually archived and on the webinar. I just very quickly want to also welcome everyone to attend the last of our webinars for this fiscal year. We have on June 30th a webinar called the 8 R's of a trauma-responsive mindset and approach to educating in our new normal. So we have two expert women, Dr. Sean Neely Opara and also Tori Scruggs Hussein, who will be presenting on June 30th. And again, we know how important dealing with the trauma that everyone is experiencing right now is going to be for really working with all of our students as we start back up into the school year. So again, thank you to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Paul, Zaida, thank you. And thank you again to CDE for making all of this possible. All right. Bye, everybody.